Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Haitian Revolution Part 4, Liberation by Extra History. Now last time we saw, as the Haitian Revolution truly kicked off, Toussaint Louverture emerged as one of the early revolutionary leaders, and we ended with the arrival of Sontenax and Polverel, two French commissioners who'd be very important to this part of the story. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Saint-Domingue, September 1792. Two men arrive from France. They're here to address the question of rights for the free people of color. It is the second commission, the first group having carried a completely different message. But this group makes their intentions clear when they land. They're here to ensure the free people of color receive full rights.
Right, so this is Sontenax and Polverel. They've arrived. Their mandate says they're here to enforce racial equality. What that means is equal rights for the free people of color, not for the enslaved people. They are not here to end slavery. That is not part of their mandate. They're also here to put down counter-revolution. Now, that is sort of the mandate they've been given by the French government. They're going to end up doing a lot more than that.
As French law now requires. They will radically integrate the assemblies. And they've brought 6,000 troops to make sure that everyone, rebellious slaves and big whites alike, stay in line. To tamp down the murmurings amongst the big whites, they say their orders do not include the abolition of slavery. They're here to save slavery, they say, not end it. But end it is exactly what this second commission will end up doing.
Yep.
And their 6,000 troops, they'll not nearly be enough.
Yep. Those two things are connected, by the way.
Despite assurances, the white population of Saint-Domingue feared the commissioners were secretly working toward emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the relationship between the colony of Saint-Domingue and France, the metropole here, right? And all these shifting alliances, how one faction never trusted the other for a long period of time, right? So the big whites here, their sort of thing, even prior to the revolution, has always been that they wanted autonomy from France. They wanted the ability to govern their own affairs, which meant, treating their slaves as brutally as they wanted, denying racial equality to the free people of color. They didn't like these things that they saw the French government as imposing on them. Now, they've had a complicated relationship with the government here. We saw the French revolutionary government at times was trying to push racial equality, at times was pulling back, right? So there's been sort of a back and forth here, and the big whites, though these commissioners have tried to sort of earn their trust, they're pretty suspicious.
And there was a reason for that. Both commissioners were known abolitionists, and the big and small whites made the decision to refuse to work with the commission, comply with their laws, or even help them fight the rebellion.
Yeah, so these two commissioners, they're associated with the Girondin faction back in France, a faction that was pretty powerful at this time. If you remember in a previous episode, I talked about how the Girondin faction was associated with the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which was this abolitionist society back in France. Right? There were a lot of pretty notable Girondin members. The Girondins were the sort of moderate branch of the radical faction, right? So they're the sort of moderate branch of the Jacobins. The Montagnards are the radical branch of the radical faction, right? So they're here. They're known abolitionists, and thus the big whites essentially ignore them. Government authority isn't especially strong in this moment. There's revolution happening from all different sides, and they sort of say, man, we're going to do our own thing, which sort of leaves the commissioners out to dry. They go, oh, well, what do we do now?
The free people
We need to find another base of support.
of color, though, were only too happy to show their loyalty to the commission. Soon, the free people of color and French troops were fighting side by side, making great progress against both white separatists and black rebels.
So here what you see is the free people of color are sort of, at this point, the greatest allies of these French commissioners, and we see the continuation of a trend that had been true prior to the revolution. We also talked about this in a previous episode, that colonial militias, or the Saint-Domingue's colonial militias, often had the free people of color overrepresented because they felt that their best protection against the domination of these big white planters was the French metropolitan government. Now, that government did not serve them very well, frankly, but they felt that was the best stopgap in the protection of their rights. And so we sort of see the continuation of this trend here with the free people of color essentially saying, hey, we'll be your base to Sontenax and Polverel. We will be your loyal allies against these big white planters who are not interested in listening to the revolutionary government of France.
Which was good, because roughly 5 minutes after the commission got to the colony, yellow fever turned their 6,000 reinforcements into 3,000.
Yeah,
But
this is another trend that will continue. Whenever you have fresh troops sent in from France to the colony, a lot of them almost immediately die from yellow fever. They are just not acclimatized, right? So this is disease will be a big part of essentially every campaign fought in Saint-Domingue.
this alliance only deepened suspicions that the commissioners meant to end slavery.
Right.
Suspicions that boiled over when the commission issued a decree that they were reinstituting the long-ignored Code Noir, a set of regulations governing the treatment of the enslaved, from providing proper food, clothing, and housing, to opening channels the enslaved could use to report abuse. This
Now, I will point out the Code Noir had been this sort of long-standing set of regulations in relation to slavery. Now, it was extremely racist and did not call for good treatment of the enslaved people, but it was some type of regulation, right? So it was some restriction on the action of plantation owners, and essentially, in those decades leading up to the Haitian Revolution, as we talked about, these big white planters had tried to enforce white supremacy more than ever. They tried to deny free people of color any sort of basic rights, and they tried to essentially increase their control over their slaves, which meant ignoring something like the Code Noir. So, sort of reinforcing this is a very racist set of brutal regulations, but it is like the smallest type of check and balance on the white plantation owners, which infuriates them, right? As we know, they were not willing to compromise even a little bit. So this they see as a direct affront to their authority over their slaves, as they saw their property.
was the last straw for the big whites. They had already been buddying up to the new governor, a pro-slavery plantation owner like them, and soon he was insulting the commission and threatening to counteract their decrees.
Mm-hmm.
So, the commissioners
So, I mean, you've got like direct civil conflict here, direct infighting, where the governor here is sort of on the side of these big whites who are essentially disloyal to the French revolutionary government. You have these representatives of the government, these commissioners arriving, once again with a direct mandate from the French revolutionary government, and they find their base initially among the free people of color, right? So this is sort of direct, sort of civil war here. Now, there's one faction that we haven't yet colored, which is the enslaved people. Now, of course, they're also going to be a very big part of this.
deciding that this constituted rebellion, marched into Le Cap and imprisoned the governor. Except he escaped, and all hell broke loose.
Yep.
The governor rallied his troops and attacked Le Cap, where the commissioners and soldiers were now based, besieging and taking the city. But during the fight, fires ignited the Colonial port, burning down most of the city's grand Paris-style buildings, operas, and boulevards. The commissioners themselves ended up outside of the city and needing reinforcements. Worse still, both Spain and Britain had declared war on France.
Yep.
So the Spanish got busy sponsoring and fighting alongside rebels like Toussaint Louverture, while word was a British force was already on the way. The commission
A lot of the rebels find allies among these foreign forces, the Spanish in particular, and there are some deals made, deals where they will recognize the freedom and independence of these people, the freedom of these formerly enslaved people if they sort of fought alongside the Spanish. You have a variety of different deals made. This is very piecemeal. Remember, it's not like the sort of revolting slaves are just one big faction. No, there's a lot of different factions. So at different times, different factions are allied with, the Spanish, with the sort of royalist French, with the revolutionary French, the free people of color, the big, it's very complicated here, but you do see some alliances made between some of these revolutionary groups and the Spanish as, the French Revolution is going international, as we see war breaking out between France and all of its neighbors. Obviously, that's going to have an impact here in the Caribbean.
needed troops fast. So they did something unorthodox, maybe out of desperation, or maybe because they saw an opening for a move they wanted to make anyway. They put the word out that any formerly enslaved person who fought for them would gain their freedom and full French citizenship.
Yep.
Rebels thronged in from the countryside.
You could imagine that the big whites were, I mean, they already didn't like the commissioners. They were outraged by this. To them, this was proof of everything they'd said. The big whites saw this as proof that these were two ideological abolitionists who took this opportunity to free the slaves. Now, that's not exactly what's happening here. I mean, they were sort of abolitionists, but remember, that did not necessarily mean instant freedom. That oftentimes meant a much longer, gradual, sort of abolition process. Probably what caused this was the more immediate needs on the ground. Sontenax and Polverel, they just need more troops. They're not going to be able to keep fighting back unless they have more people to fight for them. I said at the end of last episode, if you sort of think about, they bring thousands of troops with them, a lot of them die from yellow fever. They have the backing of the free people of color, but that's in the grand scheme of Saint-Domingue, a minority population. They need more troops. What is the one massive population on the island? Well, the enslaved people, who are now a lot of them the sort of formerly enslaved people as they've risen up. And so, I think out of necessity, they turn to this population. And also, they're ideologically abolitionists, so they're not necessarily opposed to doing this. They essentially say, this is freedom in exchange for service. You come and serve with us, and you may earn your freedom. And we see some similar things in the American Revolution, say with Dunmore's Proclamation, right? Where the British essentially say, hey, come and serve with us fighting against the American patriots, and you will earn your freedom. Right, so this is not necessarily unprecedented, but it's a big move. As you can imagine, it really shakes things up.
To join their forces, and they pushed the big whites and their allied governor out of Le Cap. Over half of the colony's white population boarded boats and fled overnight, but now agreeing to free a few people with.
And this is when we begin to see a lot of the emigration that was so associated with the French Revolution. We now see that associated with the Haitian Revolution too. As we all know, at the end of all this, say at the independence of Haiti, there will not be many white people left in Haiti, and by not many, I mean almost none, right? So we're talking about either killed or a lot of them, they'll emigrate, they'll leave, right? They want to get the hell out of there. Same thing, a lot of these French aristocrats in France, they want to emigrate. They don't want to deal with this because they're worried about violence to their person and, of course, seizure of their property, right? And that's what a lot of these plantation owners are worried about, that their plantations will be seized if they haven't already been, and they will be killed. And so they flee. Now, they go to a variety of places, Some go back to France, but a lot don't, because a lot of them at this point are not fans of the revolutionary government. You know what I mean? Some are royalists, some, if not royalists, are sort of counter-revolutionaries. They go to places throughout the Americas. A lot of them go to the United States, right? So we see a lot of them heading to the young United States, arriving in places like Charleston and Philadelphia in particular. You see a lot of these sort of French migrants, emigres from Saint-Domingue, who arrive in places like Philadelphia, forming a sort of fairly prominent community there, right? So you see a lot of this emigration at this point, and that will continue throughout the revolution here.
With conditions, let the genie out of the bottle. Once Saint-Domingue's formerly enslaved population heard that emancipation was in fact on the table, rumors of abolition raced across the North Province, and on August 29th, 1793, the commissioners took the leap. Pressed by the rebels, Spain, and now Britain, the colony slipping away, they did the one thing that they believed could turn the tide.
Yep.
A general emancipation.
Yeah, so they start off with this more targeted abolition. Hey, service for freedom. And then, they feel the only way they can save this colony, because their ultimate goal is to keep Saint-Domingue under French control. That's something that I think Napoleon could have done to remember a couple years later. And so they sort of see the only way to do this is to have general emancipation. And once again, they're not opposed to that because they're abolitionists. They sort of decide that is the move that needs to be taken. Sontenax sort of leads the way, with Polverel sort of trailing behind. But they are, largely acting in conjunction. Though Sontenax is definitely the more enthusiastic of the two.
All former slaves born in the colony, along with their families, would be freed. Yet while this news was greeted with enthusiasm in the rebel-held North Province, not all the rebels came to the Commission's aid.
Yeah.
Toussaint Louverture and many other generals were skeptical of whether this promise of freedom would hold. After all, the Commission was exceeding their authority. Indeed, they'd even gotten a recall order due to their actions. And
Yeah.
the last colonial governor who'd overstepped had been recalled to France and guillotined.
And I will say, you also want to remember the political situation back in France. They sort of arrive, I think, in 1792. As the politics in France progress into 1793, 94, what are we getting? We're getting the Reign of Terror. And remember, these fellows are associated with the Girondin faction. Well, what happens? Well, the Montagnards, led by Robespierre, take over, and they execute all those Girondin leaders. And so, these guys are going to be increasingly in trouble as all of their allies in government, either leave or then are executed, right? So they're sort of increasingly losing support from the revolutionary government back in France. So there is pretty strong reason to believe that a lot of these orders are not going to stand, and that, in fact, when these guys go back, they might lose their heads.
Also, this Republican French government had already become infamous for changing its mind.
Right.
Because remember last episode when the free people of color had rights and then they didn't,
Yeah.
and then they did again? Yeah, well, the rebels remembered that too.
Yeah.
Not to mention previous trades of freedom for military service had also gone badly. And Louverture, along with these other generals, had a more consistent ally. A rival power who owned the western half of the island. Spain. In fact, though Spanish troops had only crossed the border recently, Spain had covertly supported the slave rebellion since its earliest days. But now with open war declared, Louverture's forces were receiving arms, ammunition, and even uniforms from the Spanish.
Yeah, so they're sort of thinking, yeah, I guess we could ally ourselves with these commissioners, but one, their orders probably aren't going to stick. Two, we don't necessarily trust them. The government has been so flip-floppy that Toussaint and a lot of these revolutionary generals are pretty suspicious. They're sort of thinking, maybe we should try and forge our own way with support from the Spanish.
And that alliance with Spain did seem more suited to Louverture. After all, Spain had not promised them liberation. It offered to recognize that the enslaved had liberated themselves. Spanish political policies, too, lined up with the rebels. Because most of the rebels were royalists, who, due to incorrect rumors, believed King Louis was pro-emancipation. They disliked revolutionary ideals and symbols, mostly because their enemies, the small whites and the free people of color, had enthusiastically adopted them.
Yeah, I mean, you see this royalism among these enslaved people revolting, especially at this time. That will sort of change, of course. But there is this idea about the king, but also more so, or maybe not more so, but it's also just that a lot of these whites had initially adopted revolutionary ideas, iconography especially. And so these people are just very suspicious. These leaders like Toussaint are thinking, I just don't know if I can trust this revolution, these commissioners, any of this. The French Revolution, I mean. They're thinking it might be better to, as I said, sort of blaze their own trail, go their own way with support from the Spanish. We talked about how the French Revolution, you have this idea of everyone being born equal, and how that obviously is in conflict with the idea of slavery. But once again, there were plenty of these Enlightenment or liberal types who, on the one hand, claimed to fully believe this idea of everybody being born equal, but on the other hand, fully supported slavery. So there was really, no guarantee that the French revolutionary government would ideologically oppose slavery. That just was not a guarantee. I mean, look at the United States. That was a very similar liberal revolution that had decided to keep slavery and keep people enslaved, right? So initially you might think, oh, it's sort of weird that a lot of these rebels would rather side with the king than the revolution. But when you really think about it, it's not that shocking at this point. Now, like I said, the situation is dynamic. The politics will evolve. But I don't think it's that surprising, really.
Not to mention, Republican France was making moves on religion, suppressing the Catholic Church and replacing it with their own secular variant. And most of the rebels found that deeply offensive. Yeah, that's a wild story, actually, and we'll get to it, one day. But there were also cracks forming in this Spanish alliance as well. First of all, the war in Europe had turned, and Republican France suddenly looked like it might win. Second, The big whites who'd evacuated to Barbados had convinced the British to invade, under the specific promise of restoring slavery and racial apartheid.
Yeah, so you see and this is where, we've talked a lot about here events in Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, and events in France. This is where you can see the sort of relationship between the two, right? Obviously, events in France affect very much what's going on here in Saint-Domingue, but also there are unique situations on the ground. You've got your own thing going on. So there's this interesting dynamic between the two, where, they affect each other, but they're not always necessarily going in the same direction. But we can see here that the big whites sort of call on the British to bail them out, restore slavery, which is sort of funny because the British Empire, during and especially after this time, after the Napoleonic Wars, always loved to portray themselves as this great abolitionist empire. But that's not entirely true. I mean, they were also a great slaving empire. Anyway, this is somewhat similar to what happens in Toulon, right? Where a lot of these French leaders, you'd call them counter-revolutionaries, essentially call in the British and say, hey, come save us. The revolution's getting too radical, right? So you see, the Brits called in as sort of conservative shock troopers to try and defeat these revolutionary forces, right? So, these international forces are getting involved here.
Wherever the Royal Navy landed ships and took ports, they put everyone right back in bondage. So technically, this alliance with the Spanish put the rebels on the same side as the British-aligned plantation
Yeah, which was a little awkward.
owners. And Louverture knew this was not sustainable.
Right. And so you're already starting to see how this situation might shift, right? These two commissioners have arrived. They have first offered, service for freedom, or freedom for service, I should say. They've now declared general emancipation, and now your own alliances are looking a little more shaky, right? Spain isn't doing so hot. You're essentially on the same side as the extremely conservative British, who are re-enslaving people on behalf of the big whites. You can sort of see why some of these revolutionary generals like Toussaint Louverture might say, you know what? Maybe now's the time to switch sides. Maybe it's time to go over to the revolution.
See, he had advantages that other rebel generals did not. Louverture was literate, had briefly owned a farm with slaves, and he had been in
Oh.
plantation management. This meant that not only could he keep up correspondence with allies, but he had also long practiced navigating white society. Now sure, the Spanish had other rebel allies, but Louverture kept up a lively correspondence. And actually, not just with his allies, but with his French enemies as well.
Mm-hmm.
This would become a hallmark of Louverture's strategy.
Hmm.
A savvy politician, he would always seek favor from all sides.
Once again, I think I said this before, Louverture, a savvy politician, a negotiator, a unifier. This was his thing, right? He was in contact with everybody, and he always wanted to bring people together, as long as it was under his control, of course.
And his vision of the colony always consisted of integrating the island's black, white, and free people of colored population into a single society.
Right, and I also mentioned this again, I think last time, but this is very uniquely Toussaint Louverture. His vision for Saint-Domingue, for Haiti, is a multiracial society. In fact, very fundamentally, it's a multiracial society. You can see that in a lot of his writing and speeches. Those who come after Louverture, Toussaint, for example, his vision is of a black society, right? So this is something that changes when Toussaint is captured and killed by the French, or he dies in prison, but he's basically killed by the French eventually, right? Toussaint has this very particular vision for Saint-Domingue that you'd think would best align with the French vision as well. I think, they made a big mistake when they captured and let Louverture die. But that's his idea for Saint-Domingue after all this violence is over. He wants this multiracial society in which everyone can live side by side and the colony can keep making a lot of money. Now, to some, that's a controversial vision. Of course, the big whites don't want a multiracial society. They want white supremacy. But we're sort of moving past that point. And of course, a lot of the enslaved people don't want to go back to their plantations. But if need be, Louverture will force them. But so, there's a lot of stuff that people disagree with there at that time. But that's sort of his vision for Saint-Domingue. And I think that's a vision that these commissioners can largely agree with. That's kind of what they're going for, too. What do they want? Well, they want a colony where the slaves are freed, the sort of racial equality, but where these plantations are going to keep going and they're going to keep producing coffee and sugar and indigo because they want to keep making money for France, right?
But he was not naive. He knew that the freedom the Spanish were promising was at odds with the revived slave system the British were offering the big whites, and he
Mm-hmm.
saw Spain's commitment to racial equality wavering. As both news and the rhetoric of abolition crept across Saint-Domingue, both his political ideas about general emancipation and his political calculus began to shift. Because the revolution was beginning to craft its end goal, a thing that had been nebulous and confused up to this point:
Mm.
the complete abolition of slavery. Also, the French were eager for Louverture to defect. Despite having no military experience before the rebellion, he had blossomed into one of the most able commanders of the conflict.
Yeah.
When he captured European officers, he treated them well and had them instruct his men. He ensured they operated.
Both due to his vision for the colony and also his leadership and skill as a politician and a general, the French really want Toussaint on their side at this point.
Operated like a modern military, but also kept one foot in the guerrilla tactics that had served the rebellion so well. And he had the most important strategic position in the colony, garrisoning a line of forts that separated the rebel-held North Province from the French-held South and West.
Mm.
He had effectively split the French force, the commissioners in the North and the free colored troops in the South. Then, something incredible happened. In February of 1794, representatives of the colony spoke before the National Convention on the issue of slavery. It was a tricolor commission, consisting of one of the big whites, a free black army officer, and a free person of color.
And once again, this is very much a sort of Louverture vision of Saint-Domingue, right? A tricolor society. These three different groups making a multiracial, equal society.
They argued that emancipation was the only way to keep control of the vital economic engine of Saint-Domingue.
And that's sort of the practical argument for emancipation at this point, which is why it really begins to pick up steam. Of course, you have some abolitionists who have ideologically supported abolition, but one of the reasons it does start to pick up support, a lot of support at this point, is the argument that, look, Saint-Domingue, the colony's in chaos, a lot of it's in ruins. You're not going to send these people back to slavery. It's not happening. If you try, you're probably going to lose the colony to the British and the Spanish. The only way you're going to keep this colony and keep making money is to promise emancipation and work with the formerly enslaved people to reclaim the colony. And then, work out some other labor system to farm these plantations. That's the only way this is going to work. And a lot of people sort of align with that, right? That's the sort of practical money-making motivation for emancipation beyond just the sort of ideology.
Not to mention, it was also the purest expression of Republican principles. They got more than they bargained for. Not only did the
Yep.
National Convention end slavery in Saint-Domingue, they ended slavery in all French colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, they declared that all men living in France and its possessions, regardless of the color of their skin, were full citizens and protected by the Constitution.
Yeah, so the French revolutionaries, and there's going to be a lot of hypocrisy here in the long run, and one Napoleon Bonaparte will oppose this, but the French revolutionaries essentially take that step that the American revolutionaries didn't, and they say, yeah, you know what? When we say all men were created equal, we meant it. Yeah, fine, yeah, everyone created equal. We're going to have equality among everyone regardless of race, and we're going to abolish slavery because it obviously doesn't fit with that idea, right? So once again, it's complicated. There's a lot of hypocrisy, etc., etc., a lot of caveats, but they do take this step where they say, all right, yeah, everyone is created equal. We really meant it.
Upon hearing that the French had actually fulfilled their promise of emancipation, Louverture ditched his Spanish allies and switched sides.
Right.
He now had the largest and most professional force in the colony, allies that aligned with his political goals, a strategic position to fight both the Spanish and British, and the backing of a major power. By 1795, Spain was knocked out of the war, ceding their side of the island to France. British troops were dying in droves of yellow fever, with 30,000 more on the way to help end the war. Yet it would do no good. The time of the European powers in Haiti was waning, and the rebel generals would instead turn on each other. For the war of muskets and uniforms was over, and the war of knives had begun.
Yep. Alrighty, another good episode. And they're right. As these European powers start to ditch, we will see that these rebel generals start to accrue a lot more power. Toussaint in particular, but he'll have a lot of rivals, so there's quite a lot of drama to come. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.